Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? May the 4th be with you. Yeah, it's 2017, May the 4th. It's like 40 years since that movie was released. That's insane. Anyhow, this video today is a video response to a video response to a video response I did to a question posed on Facebook in the RPG Brigade. And so it's got a little convoluted. I figured it would be kind of an easy question to answer, and then I was thinking about it. I realized that I need to frame it in some more context, and so I'm going to give you the context of the question, give you the question itself, and then kind of give you the context of my answer, and then give you my answer, and hopefully but because I think it's important when it comes right down to it. And so the original video or a question was by Lee, your humble game master. I made a video on that already. He talked about the hypothesis he had that perhaps game masters might gravitate towards more rules light, rule sets, and players might gravitate towards more rules heavy because of the advantages of you get all these extra goodies as a player. And so I answered no, I don't believe so. And I mentioned in the video itself near the end, and I think I just kind of came up with this on the fly, either making the video or maybe in a typed response I made prior. That there's a point in a rule set where the rules become complex enough where it starts to break immersion for me, and that's where I don't like it. It's personal. And so Bankbar Como, asked me, hey, can you clarify this a little bit? And so the question he had, because he's an apologist for bigger rule sets, like things like Roll Masters, one of his favorites, if I understand correctly. And he said, well, these a lot of times are presented, at least in that system, in a very simple, direct way, which is easy to understand. And he's talking about in like, say, combat. There's 30 or 40 qualifiers in Rollmaster combat. However, they're all direct and obvious and intuitive. And so the real question is, like, when complex mechanics are intuitive, do they break immersion? Anyway. And so part of the things he talked about is the long list. There's the table. Is it just like calculating what is my tonal bonus, all that sort of stuff. So I thought that was going to be a really easy question to answer. But then I realized I kind of had to frame it a little bit and back up, frame my answer and frame the context of my answer. So I made a video, man, a while ago now, and I called it "The Wire is Life." And then I talked about a working hypothesis of my own that I believe we're all really seeking some level of immersion. The question is, in what are we being immersed? What kind of immersion are we seeking? And it's funny, these are things that I did not have a language for when I started playing, and for a long time afterwards. I kind of struggled for a language for that. And fortunately, I found one within the discussion of like the RPG Brigade, looking at some of the stuff that the Forge had made, whatnot. Gave me some context for discussing things. And so there's different things you can be immersed in. There's different facets of the game experience that you might just float your boat, that you're really into it. It could be that just creating a cool story is your thing. And if, as collaboratively or however it's going on, you start to create this cool story, you may be entirely engrossed in that, and time stops. I was thinking about it too today. There's not really gameplay, but there are people that when they start to develop a world, and I've certainly had this happen to me a little bit here and there, where I'm come up with something, I'm kind of writing a story-ish, maybe a little backstory or whatever, that I become engrossed in that. I'm sure Tim Harper has lost like 5 or 6 hours at a shot creating a world. I guarantee you. Doing that sort of stuff. But I digress. There's other people that, for overcoming challenges and strategy, all that sort of stuff, that's where they get immersed. The people that are out there rolling the dice, and they've got the charts and tables out, and they're really kind of positioning their minis on the board. And that becomes, the time stops. They're right there in the zone. And then there's other people for whom, they really gravitate towards games which facilitate an experience where you're experiencing the game world as if it and your character were real. What is my character like? What would he do here? And I did this. I gravitated toward that last style long before I knew what the difference was, before I had the words for it. I've enjoyed all those kind of styles to a degree, a little less of the story creation, but I certainly like sitting there and thinking about something and daydreaming and all that stuff. So I get getting immersed in that way as well. And I've certainly enjoyed, playing really tactically and, what is my, bonus here and that stuff. But playing it in that last way where, I was experiencing the game world as if it and my character were real, the kind of simulationism when it comes right down to it, that felt the most natural. That's where I felt the most in the zone, where like, I'd drive home and say, man, that was a really good session. Well, that's what happened during that session. I didn't realize that at the time, but kind of looking back at it. I played the Lamentations of the Flame Princess game that I talk about all the time. The campaign that I was in, several years ago now. It's hard to believe it that much time has gone by. I knew who those characters were. They were real. The NPCs were real. The situation was real in my head, and it wasn't just because I was crazy. I was really enjoying it. I mean, like I was right there, knocking my bottle over here, my empty Powerade bottle. But I knew who these people were. It was very immersive for me, and it was immersive. I didn't understand at the time, but because I was really immersed in my character and who the other characters were. And there's something, a question I really didn't think about. I remember, I was having a discussion in this RPG discussion group not so long ago. I think I actually even kind of mentioned it. And, there was something about story now, and I kind of just asked a question about that because I'd forgotten some of the nuances of it. But, part of what I didn't realize, I think it's something I'd heard a bunch of times, read it a bunch of times, and never just really sunk in. You ever have that happen where, so the 50th time you look at something, you're like, oh, I never noticed that before. Well, that happened to me here. I started to realize that, immersion could be either internal or external in terms of what are you actually focusing on. And these three different game styles that they talk about in the GNS theory and an awful lot, some of these really focus on the external experience, and some of them really focus on the internal experience. And I just really hadn't caught that before. And for me, immersion happens internally, and being yanked back to the external world, at some point breaks the immersion for me, and then my game experience suffers. And yeah, sure, like talking about rules itself, I can learn a system over time to the point where I don't notice it. It's kind of like riding a bike. You just get on, you do it. I mean, if I played first edition Dungeons and Dragons, I know how to do that. But the thing is, I'm not 13 years old anymore. I'm not going to spend the time learning some crazy complex system. That one's crazy, but some make more sense. I still love it to death, but just because I grew up with. And I'm going to link not only that video I made, but I'm also going to link some videos by Emergent Play, which kind of explain these three game styles really succinctly. But I was kind of clued back into it. I'm also going to link or put down in the description of this video rather some text after those videos about just describing these three different styles a little bit more. And Right to Dream, which is simulationism, and this which focuses really on this internal experience. I didn't really think about it at the time, but you're thinking about this. What is it really like to be this character? What is this world really like? You're making decisions, you're interacting with people, but it's kind of an internal, big time theater of the mind, for lack of a better term. There's something like Story Now, which talks about narrativism, where you're focusing on this story, experiencing the story, creating the story, plan story frame, plan story arc. But this can be very external. I didn't really think about it at the time. It was one of those things I looked at and said, hey, I didn't notice that before. But it makes sense because you're watching this as an observer. You're involved, but there's a certain point where you're an observer and a creator. More so than in like a simulationist session. And the last one is they call Step Right Up. Very catchy. The idea that it's very gamist. Performance. You're focusing on your performance in the game environment, overcoming challenges, system mastery, which can be a lot of fun. But once again, it's very external. There's charts and graphs and mathematics and miniatures and all that kind of stuff involved. And so you're kind of using this avatar and this of yourself or just an avatar period, and it's an external experience. So, that's part of it for me. I didn't realize at the time, but that's what I was looking for, or like where I'm really the happiest. And this is kind of a personal video, but that's where I'm really the happiest, is having that internal experience. Now, let's go back to the question itself. Let me answer the question with this. Once again, we're talking about something where these rules are really intuitive. Is that going to break the immersion from me? Even if the rules are, they're complex, but they're intuitive, they're direct, they're obvious, they make good common sense. So a few things that happen. I remember we had that thing when I was a kid, where we'd get all these extra rules every once in a while from Dragon magazine, and they all looked really cool on their own. But you started to adding all those up, and then all of a sudden, it became this big giant unwieldy monster. It was too much, But each rule on its own, really intuitive. I'm just not going to memorize all these now because I'm like 49 years old. I don't have the time to do that. With something like tables and charts, which also can be really cool. Something like Dungeon Crawl Classics, for example. One I'm more familiar with lately I've looked at. It's this giant book. It's like a freaking dictionary. All the charts are really cool. It can be very player first intention and really kind of funny, and gamey, but, still a hoot. Critical hit tables can be very realistic. You know, I was watching a video by Nolan Inquisitor not so long ago. I'm sorry, he probably made 1 or 2 years ago, but talking about like critical hit tables and how they're going to be can be very, they can simulate reality quite a bit. I'm not sure if that's exactly, I don't believe that's exactly the same as simulationist, but it's simulating that part of reality. And you know, once again, that can be really, they can be really realistic. But you know, what happens for me is whether it's a table or you know a large rule set. Once I have to start referencing outside material, then immersion gets broken for me. And sure, we use things like dice and character sheets, so we're always kind of referencing outside material within the game. Every once in a while, no matter how immersed I am, I'm in, you know, playing all for one, you know, because those characters are getting real for me now. But I'm looking down at my character sheet, and okay, this is 7 dice, this is this, whatever. You know, rolling the dice, and that can be fun too. So there's this external, you know, reference material going on as well, or external experience, but it's minor. But when I'm constantly having to reach down and look at this book, look at this page number, or referencing charts and graphs, that's where immersion starts to get broken for me. And then, you know, Bankbar went on to talk about some examples. He said, okay, well, what about combat? So say you've got this really intuitive rule set, and is that going to break immersion? And so here's my answer for that. What it boils down to me all of a sudden is like, am I making decisions based upon tactical modifiers? And he even mentioned that a little bit. Now there's a point where that starts to happen for me in a larger rule set, and it's just intelligent to do that. You know, I think I even made a video about like what would you do, what would my character really do here, and what would be the tactically sound thing to do. So once I find myself with a rule set that gets complex enough that I start to make decisions based on those tactical modifiers, then that really starts to break immersion for me. The flip side of that is, which I think he was also getting at, is, you know, when I'm making decisions, or part of what he was getting at, when I'm making decisions based on common sense without considering modifiers, like I'm going to get the high ground here, I'm going to flank this guy, you know, I'm going to sneak up behind him, you know, I'm going to you know, crouch low to protect myself. These are all common sense, okay? But modifiers exist, you know, to support them. If the game is complex to the point where calculating the effects of all those modifiers afterwards gets too much, that can take me out of the moment and break immersion as well. And that's where it starts to, you know, the more complex the game, the more likely that is to happen for me. One of the things, it's funny, I'm a stickler for mathematics, you know, believe it or not, after saying all that, and probability and whatnot. And so I'm not 100% sold on the mathematics, you know, of the advantage-disadvantage 2D quantity mechanic that something like 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons uses, which they did not make up. There's, you know, other games have been using that for a long time. But I think it's still kind of brilliant because it can result in increased immersion for people like me, where instead you can make all these common sense decisions and then just say, okay, that's really good, you get to roll 2 dice instead of 1 and take the highest. So, you know, despite my mathematical protests, that's a really cool idea to use something like that in a game that starts to get complex. Oh, here's this optional rule, just do this. That can kind of you know, preserve immersion for somebody like myself. And last but not least, there's something to be said, not just for learning a system, but there's the point in a system like, you know, I like rules light to rules medium, and I would say like something like Ubiquity, which I'm really enjoying, is kind of firmly in the rules medium camp. It's pretty much getting to the point where too much higher than that, I'm starting to like, you know, glaze over, and my eyes are glazing over, and I'm kind of having my immersion broken. I'm being brought back to the real world. They've yanked me out of the Matrix. But gaining an intuitive knowledge, you know, practical use of a system, you know, just getting a working knowledge of a system where you can kind of eyeball modifiers and not look at a chart, not look it up in a book, where you're maybe you're off a bit at the end of the day if you really looked it all up and say, oh, I gave him a +3 here, or, you know, gave him 4 dice and it really should have been, you know 5 dice, or should have been only a +2, but it's close enough for government work. You can pretty much do that, and that works for me as well. And you know, I can do that in old school D&D without even thinking about it. There's, you know, games like Advanced Fighting Fantasy, you know, that Francois turned me on to, you know, JDR 30, which very obvious that's really easy to do. Even something like Ubiquity, you know, it becomes very, you know, evident. You know, as I was talking to Rumslinger, and you start to look at, okay, yeah, +2 dice here. You know, this is a -4 die penalty because it's really hard. You start to develop this really, you know, working knowledge of the system, where maybe you screwed up a little bit. You know, that also kind of brings immersion back for me. So that's a lot of context to answer a really simple question. But yeah, at the end of the day, I have this really internal experience. of the game world. That's where I find find myself the most immersed. And when a system gets to the point, a rule set gets to the point where it starts to yank me out of that, and I have to reference external equipment, or external devices, you know what I mean, books, charts, they're not stuff. That brings me out of it. When I start doing calculations, that breaks the immersion for me, because I'm not the happiest having that challenging, tactical gamist experience. I'm not the happiest having an experience where we're creating this story on purpose and making it a really cool story. That's not where I really I'm really the happiest. That's not really where I want to be immersed. I find myself the happiest and enjoying the game, and where it's I'm driving home saying, man, that was a really good session, where I'm really inhabiting this character, not acting, because I'm a terrible actor. I'm not a thespian. But I'm inhabiting this character, making decisions like they would, and interacting in a game world, which for that duration I believe is real. So hopefully that answered the question.